Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. Garlic behind the ear. I remember a particularly harsh winter when frost covered even the most sheltered windows, and the air seemed to carry the weight of the snow piling up on the rooftops. The village, small and reserved, lived wrapped in a silence broken only by the crackle of firewood in the hearths and the distant lowing of cows in the stable. It was in those long nights that a rumor began to spread as quickly as the chill itself. They said strange ailments had taken hold of some homes. Persistent coughs, fevers that wouldn't let up, and a lassitude that stole the shine from people's eyes. Mothers watched their children sleep, touched their foreheads, and traded anxious looks at the doorways. That was when old Marius, the village healer, appeared with his miraculous prescription. A thin man with a grey beard and hands always scented with dried herbs, he swore there was no ill that could not be overcome if one had the courage to believe in the cure. And his latest revelation caused as much astonishment as stifled laughter. The secret is garlic, but not as you think. You must rub a fresh clove behind each ear every morning to drive away the evil spirits that bring disease. And some furrowed their brows. Others chuckled behind their kerchiefs, but in those days, questioning a remedy was almost the same as tempting fate. And so, on a foggy morning, the first heads appeared with the damp sheen of freshly rubbed garlic. The aroma spread through the narrow streets, mingling with the smells of hay and wood smoke, creating an atmosphere more like a closed kitchen than a winter village. At first, only a few of the more credulous joined in, mostly widows and older peasants, but it took only a few days for even the most skeptical to give in. After all, no one wanted to be the only one to face those evil spirits unprotected. It was almost a silent pact. Better to smell like raw soup than wake up with a fever. Soon even the children, with rosy cheeks and perpetually runny noses, carried small cloves of garlic behind their ears, some tied on with strips of cloth, others simply tucked beneath their caps. When they ran, they left a pungent trail behind them, as if the whole village had come to live inside a cauldron. The curious thing was that even those who did not believe in the method's effectiveness kept using it, perhaps to avoid disapproving looks, or perhaps for the simple comfort of belonging to something that united everyone in that somber time. As the weeks passed, the habit turned into a fashion, and fashion into a temporary tradition. Conversations in the square no longer revolved only around the cold or the harvests. Now people discussed the quality of the garlic. Some argued that the most potent came from the gardens near the river, where the soil was darker and damper, while others swore the true power lay in garlic harvested under the waning moon. Marius himself, passing through the streets, smiled in satisfaction like a victorious general, giving light pats on people's shoulders and breathing in the air with a nod of approval, as if confirming that the whole village was under his aromatic protection. It didn't take long for small annoyances to surface. Young people courting in the dusk complained that when they leaned in for a whisper or a touch, they were met by a pungent gust capable of ruining any romantic mood. The goats, when being milked, seemed to draw back, bothered by the smell clinging to their owners' hands. Even the dogs, so faithful, began sniffing their owners' legs with a quizzical expression, as if trying to decipher this new village perfume. Still, no one dared stop, for in the absence of certainty, superstition was a kind of comfort. There was something almost poetic in that perfumed uniformity, as if the entire village had found the same rhythm, the same morning gesture with which to face the unknown. Every morning the same ritual repeated itself. Doors opened slowly, a wisp of smoke slipped into the cold air, and drowsy hands took a clove of garlic from the earthenware pot. The rubbing behind the ear was done with an almost ceremonial care, as if each motion warded off not only illness but any shadow that dared draw near. It was a simple act, yet laden with a quiet faith. And perhaps it was exactly that which kept the village united. For even if garlic had no power against fevers and coughs, it brought something medicine of the time could not offer, a feeling of shared protection. At the market, while trading eggs for flour, people greeted one another with smiles that said, "We're in this together." In the fields, even when sweat mixed with the acrid aroma, no one complained. After all, everyone smelled the same. The village, once scattered in isolated worries, now moved as a single body guarded by the same humble amulet. Even visitors from other villages began to notice the phenomenon, remarking with a mix of puzzlement and amusement. "It seems they're cooking something all day long," said a merchant who, after a few hours, already felt the smell clinging to his cloak. Some travelers even carried the story onward, turning the village into a kind of living legend. The place where the air was seasoned and where no one dared defy the local belief. There were those who came just to see if it was true and left carrying garlic cloves as if they were relics capable of driving away every ill. In time, the illnesses began to ebb, as so often happens with epidemics that arrive without explanation and depart the same way. Some believed the garlic had fulfilled its sacred role. Others, more discreet, preferred to think the cold was easing and strength was naturally returning. Marius, the healer, never claimed the credit for himself. He merely smiled, stroking his long beard, and said that when the evil spirits caught wind of the scent, they decided to look for more agreeable places to haunt. And so, little by little, the ritual faded, but the memory of that winter remained etched as a peculiar and sweet chapter in our story. Even today, when I return to that village, much quieter and more thinly populated than in my youth, I swear that on certain cold, windy days I can catch a faint breath of the old scent in the air. Perhaps it comes from the kitchen gardens, perhaps from my own memory, which insists on preserving details as if they were precious keepsakes. The houses, now refurbished, no longer bear smoke stains on the walls, yet they still seem to shelter the warmth of voices and laughter that once mingled with the acrid perfume of garlic. And if I linger in the square, I can almost see Marius passing by, upright and serene, checking to see whether everyone was still following his advice. That winter taught us, without our realizing it, that the cure does not always come from the wisest hands or the rarest ingredients, but very often from the courage to believe together in something, even if, to outsiders, that something is a simple and slightly absurd gesture. Today, when I remember it, I don't think of the strong smell, nor of the awkward meetings cut short by pungent gusts. I think of the human warmth that coursed through every home, of the sense of belonging that made the cold feel smaller, and I fall asleep, serene, certain that sometimes the most important thing is not to drive away evil spirits, but to learn to recognize them as pretexts for remaining united. Wine with water from the well. I remember the night when the wind slipped through the tavern's low window, rocking the wood as if it wanted to come in. The hearth crackled with restraint, tossing embers like small fallen stars, and the sweet smell of stored hay drifted up from the barn next door. Onion soup rested in the corner, yesterday's bread lay on the pine board, and an earthenware pitcher sweated in the half-light. Outside, the night breeze carried the damp of the well and the slow murmur of the stream, as if counseling silence. I, who have told too many stories for those who sleep lightly, quieted my heart and listened to the village's steps settling in. Doors closed with a patient creak, the hens nestled down, and the moon, with an old midwife's humor, kept watch over the rooftops. It was then that between shadows and embers, I remembered the day when wine, so vain of itself, grew ashamed of its own weakness. For it all began with barrels arriving in the square as if they carried a festival, and with a man of sweet speech and quick eyes. And as so often happens with old memories, I only understood what I saw much later, when the laughter no longer hurt. The merchant came on a market morning, his cloak smelling of the road, and promises wrapped like ribbons on his tongue. He brought 2 generous barrels and with a gesture like a blessing pointed to the old well behind the chapel, its stone worn and its mouth suspicious. The rope groaned as it went down, and the bucket rose silvered, bringing water that tasted of the iron of tools and the secrets of roots. I saw him tip the pitcher over the wine, slowly, like one who adds a prayer and not a river, and he blended the 2 wills. There were people nearby, bakers with hands still dusted, shepherds smelling of washed wool, and widows who knew how to listen to the world. No one said anything because hope is a silent creature, and the man smiled with teeth that promised harvests even in April. He swore that in this way the wine became gentler on the stomach, a relief for those who have worked too hard, and the phrase slipped into people's heads like a song. I, foolish and curious, noticed that the moon still winked at the bottom of the bucket in broad daylight, as if approving the trick without understanding the game. And so the village tasted what it did not know, certain that the blessing dwelled in that meeting of waters, and no one wished to be the first to doubt. In the afternoon, the merchant uncorked the barrels under the porch, and the aroma that rose was like must, with a memory of rust. The liquid ran like a tired ruby into the mugs, making spirals that reflected the pale sky, and everyone drew near as before a domestic miracle. I tasted it too, out of politeness, and caught, at the back, a breath of well, that stone coldness that lives behind the tongue and insists on telling a secret. The women said it was mild for the night's chores. The men nodded, pleased to fit one more sip between their ribs and their rest. The lads raised their mugs with market bravado, swearing they could hear grapes singing, while the old men remembered vineyards that no longer existed. The merchant, conducting the scene like one tuning invisible lutes, offered generous samples, and the coins, shy, fell into his leather purse. Old Brigida sniffed and said there was a holy freshness of a spring, and that such water mixed with wine soothes quarrels and hastens forgiveness. The chapel bell struck a long hour, and even the rooftop crow seemed to lean in to watch the little feast. And in that first sip, no one saw what the well carried in its belly. We saw only joy poured out like a sheet, newly washed in the sun. By morning, however, the village woke to discreet drums beating within, a parade of noises like famished mills. The children walked bent as if listening to the earth. The washerwomen paused, holding their bellies with the hand that still dripped soap. I myself, I confess, felt my insides speaking out loud, as if arguing an old dispute inherited from my grandparents. They brewed mint teas, blessed cloths with warm salt, and each house exhaled a mix of herbs, faith, and the oven's patience. Father Ulrich said in the square that it was a good purge, the sour humours finding their place again, and he recommended calm and small sips of water. The phrase caught like dry grass. It's the body expelling sins, they repeated, and it went from mouth to mouth, acquiring the talismans of every voice. The merchant spread his arms, humble as a procession saint, saying his wine had cleansing virtue, a rare thing in times of such excess. There were those who paid for more, not out of taste, but in the hope of finishing the crossing soon. And the man, attentive, served as if handing out indulgences. And between grimaces and wan smiles, there arose that tacit pact that saves pride. No one pointed a finger. All embraced the softer explanation. Guilt, which is fond of many costumes, chose the habit of penance that week and slept soundly on the church benches. That same afternoon, they invented the procession of jars, each carrying a little amphora as one carries a secret in the lap. The men walked bent yet dignified, saying that such pain was a blacksmith's work, hammering the metal of character on the anvil of the belly. The children, mockers by nature, turned hurried steps into a race and laughed, and then bit their lips to hide the urgency. The latrines, humble as a shepherd's hut, became wooden confessionals where small guilts were left with the rest. Old Brigida burned rue on the threshold, and the green smell entered the houses like a wind, smoothing the fringe of the curtains. Simeon the baker swore that saltless bread cures haste. He sold it all and still promised light dreams for the following night. Severino, the sacristan, hung blue ribbons on the well to tame the temperamental water and blessed the bucket with Latin I never learned by heart. The square took on the murmur of a market without music, only measured steps and whispers about virtues hidden in discomfort. And the merchant, with the air of one who understands another's pain, smiled with calculated pity and spoke of purifying destinies, pouring another thread of wine. I watched from a low bench, jotting down in my heart the little clevernesses of hope, which has always preferred to ache with meaning than to doubt without support. When the sun dropped behind the oaks, I went to the well, led less by courage than by an old curiosity. I touched the cold stones, smoothed by so many hands, and felt in them a monastic patience, as if they kept forgotten prayers. The rope smelled of fiber and shadow. I tugged a little, heard the squeak that sounded like an old man's complaint, and a wet echo answered me from afar. I lay across the rim, and the moon's face returned mine to me, warped on the skin of the water, as if asking which side the truth was on. A frog leapt from the moss and vanished into the dark, and I swear I heard a little laugh, the sort marshes keep to scare off the lazy. At that moment the merchant appeared, light as one who treads on no guilt, and spoke to me of penances that wash the soul by the shortest route. I replied that every washing needs clean water. He winked, saying purity is the repentance vocation, and the saints understand shortcuts. He moved off, leaving in the air a scent of leather and calculation, and I was left with the feeling I had conversed with a shadow that knows Latin. I returned slowly, my heart divided between my fondness for the village and the suspicion that some prayers have pockets. And the night, indulgent mother, covered everything with her mantle, as if recommending rest before truth wakes too early. The next morning they gathered in the tavern like one stitching a patch into old cloth, and Father Ulrich took the floor with a nest-warm voice. He said there are prayers the body knows before the mouth, and that when the bowels twist, they expel vanities hidden in the blood. The blacksmith agreed, swearing that every tempering needs fire and water, and that belly pain forges humility like a sword in the flames. Marta the cook advised thin broth and patience, because sin likes fat, and they laughed, softly, so as not to prod their pains. The beekeeper reported that his bees worked without quarrel that morning, a sign that heaven approved the cleansing. They set a bench in the middle and called it a brief altar, where each left small promises, strands of hair, odd buttons. The merchant, with his harvest smile, brought candles and spoke of pious sponsorships, offering light for ringing coins. No one named guilt, for guilt is a skittish bird. They preferred to say discipline, like someone tidying drawers at dusk. And they resolved to keep vigil at nightfall, giving thanks to the wine that had taught the short way to sweep the heart. I stayed in the shadow of the door, listening to the sweet hum of agreement that cloth the village spreads to cover what it does not wish to see. Later I went to Brigida's house, she who could tell blessing from trick by the smell of steam. She dripped a drop of wine onto a brazier, and the crackle was thin, like a mischievous child's laugh, and then it vanished. If the water startles, the wine betrays itself, she said, stirring a fennel tea that perfumed the afternoon with good memories. She looked at me with old well eyes and asked whether I wanted justice or quiet. I replied I wanted to sleep without breaking the neighbor's dreams. She smiled, that smile of one who has seen many mistakes turn into proverbs, and murmured, "Let the people save their own honor, it hurts less." She divided the tea into 2 clay mugs and blew to calm the rims, teaching that time heals more than it asks. She spoke of the merchant gently as one gentles a stray dog. He passes, we remain. Better that we remain whole. We agreed, without oaths, to carry water through the small hours from the high spring, to restore, quietly, what haste had mixed. I left, with my hands smelling of sweet herb, and with a rest settling on my nape like a warm scarf after the rain. And the village, breathing in its corners, seemed ready to learn the lesson without anyone pointing out the master's name. We took the high path when the night had already slipped on its slippers, and the moon, patient, walked with us like an old woman with a lantern. Brigida carried a basket with linen cloths and 2 clay jars, and I a staff that knew every stone by name. The smell of thyme woke at our steps, and there was dew on the leaves, small rosary beads that do not tire the hands. An owl watched us from a branch, blinking with the gravity of judges, and the distant stream tried out a lullaby for the road. When we reached the spring, the water gushed from the rock with the voice of an honest child, cold and without tricks, gently biting the skin of our fingers. We filled the jars slowly, like those gathering words that cannot be said aloud, and tied cloths over the mouths so that the silence would not escape. Brigida blessed the spring with the short sign of the prudent, without drawing the sky's attention, which, being so vast, hears everything. I thanked the stone for shelter and the moss for softness, and felt that that night hope had the hands of a washerwoman. We returned unhurried, leaving behind only gentle footprints and a thread of cool air, like a promise folded and kept in a pocket. We arrived before the first cockcrow, when the darkness still kept secrets in the corners of the houses. Brigida went to the tavern kitchen and, with the lightness of one who swaps pillows, replaced the water in 2 pots, while I, out in the yard, quietly washed the well's bucket. We left a blue thread tied around the necks of the jars, a keepsake from the sacristan, so luck would know where to alight. Simeon the baker showed up drowsy. I gave him a sip from the high spring, and he smiled like someone who finds the salt in his own mouth again. The sun rose slowly, and I noticed the village's footfalls sounded less strained, as if an invisible hand were loosening the belt around their insides. There were still grimaces and silences, but the rumor of famished mills in the people's chests lost teeth and patience. The merchant, seeing clearer faces, spoke of favors granted and gathered coins with the respect of one gleaning ears from the ground. I said nothing. Silence has the gift of blunting edges, and the day, so bright, preferred to agree. I merely noted in my memory that some miracles like to go barefoot, so they make no noise when they slip in through the kitchen door. On the 3rd day, bellies settled like a lake after wind, and laughter came knocking at doors with its knuckles. They said the purge had finished its work, and Father Ulrich announced a small thanksgiving, the kind that fits into a handful of candles and a familiar hymn. The women adorned the nave with sprigs of rosemary, and the church smelled of washed fields, a promise renewed without fanfare. The sacristan straightened benches and patched a kneeler, swearing that patient wood learns to forgive impatient knees. Simeon brought round loaves like domestic moons, and Marta brought clear broths, for gratitude needs no fat. The merchant, helpful, donated a thick candle and a linen cloth, and his voice, now lower, avoided the altar steps. Brigida, discreet, nodded as if to say, so be it, and saved the rest of her tea for a winter that always comes. We sang, not for victory but for rest, and rest content sat with us like an old acquaintance. When we left, the square seemed larger and each shadow lighter, as if guilt had learned to go barefoot. That same night, I found the merchant at the foot of the well, with no audience, handling his barrels like someone folding old letters. He uncapped one, smelled it with his eyes closed, and poured onto the ground a dark thread the earth drank without complaint. Then he filled the bucket at the high spring, yes, the one that speaks plainly, and washed the mouth of the cask with the movements of one unlearning a trick. He stood a while watching the water run over the stone, as if waiting for it to teach him a new way to speak. I approached with the delicacy of someone who doesn't want to wake guilt, and said only that the road forgives those who learn to walk slowly. He answered that sails are in a hurry, and that haste invents shortcuts. I replied that shortcuts bring us back to the same place, only more tired. He smiled with honest weariness, and his shoulders, for an instant, seemed the exact size of a man. He promised to bring uncontrived wine to the next market, as one promises bread without secrets. I promised to forget the excess of words. We walked back in silence, and this time the silence did not weigh. It merely guarded a small agreement that asked for no witnesses. In the week that followed, the village picked up the loom's thread as if nothing had been cut. Hands returned to their trades, and the well, with new ribbons, learned to keep silence without resentment. The children invented a crooked proverb, "You don't mix thirst with destiny," and ran laughing until they lost their breath. Prudent Brigida taught tea in a low voice and laughed with her eyes whenever someone spoke of virtuous purges. Simeon warmed loaves, and the smell of wheat reconciled the morning with the stomach, like an embrace that arrives without asking leave. The priest gave thanks for the lesson, saying grace prefers short steps and eyes attentive to springs. The merchant left at a pale dawn, smaller than when he came, but still whole, carrying less sharp promises in his purse. I watched him cross the bridge and wished the road would give him the courage to sell only what the sun can see. In his wake remained light traces and a shared learning. It's easier to mend the world when we choose to call care what might have been accusation. And amid simple prayers and recovered laughter, there was born the custom of tasting the water before the wine, out of time's own delicacy. Today, when winter presses its ear to the window and the hearth speaks softly to me, I remember the wine's blush and that trumpetless forgiveness. I drink from a warm mug and taste clean stone, accompanied by a thread of memory that doesn't hurt. I think certain truths arrive barefoot so as not to wake anyone, and that some mistakes once noticed prefer to turn into counsel. The village sleeps, the roosters delay, and the well breathes with a light chest, as if it had learned a lullaby. If some traveler asks me for the story, I tell it slowly, letting the words dry like clothes in the winter sun. I say there was pain and laughter, and a kind agreement that saved everyone's honor without wounding anyone's. I say the merchant learned a longer, cleaner road, and we, the delicacy of not pushing him to the abyss. Then I snuff the lamp, bless the high spring and the road, and let sleep gather the rest. For the world is vast, but the heart loves villages, and when it lies down without guilt, even wine dreams clear. Good night. May peace find a soft place in every ear, like a warm handkerchief folded with care. The borrowed boot. The low fire crackled like someone counting old beads, and I, with a shawl over my shoulders, can see again the village drenched by the long rains. There was the sweet smell of stored hay, the sour of hides drying, and that breeze that slipped through the cracks, bringing the rumor of the swollen stream. In those days of empty pockets and lean hopes, everything was counted, even the laces, and still our feet lacked a care you cannot improvise. By grace or by fate, we had one single boot, left with a sound sole, good leather and a firm shaft, the bravest among rags, ropes and tired sandals. I remember it set beside the hearth, shining with tallow and soot, like a small banner of dignity among pots of thin broth. And because poverty teaches its trades, we decided that boot would belong to everyone, not out of whim, but out of a need that brooked no argument. Each rain brought the same question: who would go to the fields without coming back with chilled bones and feet muddied to the ankle? The answer was simple and complicated, like almost everything that is just. The boot would go from house to house, according to the order marked in charcoal. Thus began the rotation that made us laugh and grumble in equal measure, and which, seen from afar, looks like a poor and ingenious miracle. I was there, with my wool socks darned and my heart ready to accept what time offered us, even if it smelled of wet leather. It was the elder Brigida who kept the list with steady hands, writing each family's name on the board with a charcoal stroke that seemed both blessing and sentence. At the toll of the Angelus, the person whose turn it was laced the boot to the more suffering foot, while the other stayed wrapped in rags, the gait a little lurching but grateful. When the sky wept at noon, the counting started again, and there were those who argued whether half a rein was worth half a turn, something perhaps even the saints would not know how to weigh. The boot would then travel on the arm of the tallest boy, who bore it like a relic, wrapped in a coarse cloth sack, so the leather would see no more water than it should. I remember the smell that preceded the visit, a mixture of damp wool, crushed straw, and a hint of sliced onions, as if winter had its own perfume. Some tucked sprigs of rue into the shaft, swearing it scared off damp and foul moods, and I smiled, because certain beliefs warm more than fire. Others polished the leather with tallow and a thread of old oil until the boot seemed to look back, satisfied and proud to serve again. Between one downpour and the next, little mix-ups would arise. Someone mistook Tome's house for Tueno's. Someone swore they'd heard their name when it was the neighbors. There were also those who, out of modesty, gave up their turn, and those who, out of stubbornness, claimed it. But in the end all fell silent before the rain that chose no roof, and so we went, one foot protected, the other patient, like those who learn that justice is sometimes walking while sharing the same mud. Once it fell to Firmino the miller, a man with a foot as broad as a wooden paddle, to bear the honor and the squeeze of the day. I tried to help, tugging the shaft while he held his breath, but the boot refused like a mule before a broken bridge. We decided to put it on by the old method: warm tallow on the edges, a brief prayer, and 2 little taps, the sort that sometimes persuades stubborn leather. It did not. The leather creaked a protest, and proud Firmino swore he would go like that anyway, his toes tucked up like little birds in a storm. The result was 1 high step and 1 short, and each footprint looked like a crooked proverb written in the mud. So as not to upset the order, I offered my thickest sock for the barefoot, and he thanked me as one receiving a count's mantle. He walked to the mill, and each turn of the wheel seemed to chuckle softly, beating time like a spoon on a pot rim. On the way back, he brought a sack of bran in gratitude, and the boot, tired, smelled of damp flour, a good thing mingled with the sour of rain. Brigida wrote on the board, "Firmino paid in bran, and the village thought it fair, for justice also accepts gifts that fill the belly." And I, aside, thought that poverty was teaching us a new dance to adjust our step to the shoe we've been given. Another time, it was the widow Joanna who received it, and careful, she let the boot dry beside the pot of turnip soup. When she put it on at dawn, there rose with it a dubious perfume, half garden, half stable, that spread along the street like a procession. The dogs lifted their snouts, the hens made way, and I, behind her, had to pretend I smelled nothing, out of respect for good Joanna. She, poor thing, even stopped by the chapel, where the sacristan swore the odor recalled an old incense, only more earthly. The priest, a prudent man, opened the door to ventilate the saints and blessed us with a quick gesture, like one who shoos flies with benedictions. We laughed softly, without malice, and Joanna laughed too, saying smells are like relatives. Some we welcome, others we visit, only on the patron's feast. That afternoon, while the rain returned, we washed the shaft with warm water and a handful of ashes, and the leather sighed, relieved of its turnips. Brigida added a little star to the register, a sign that the boot had undergone a trial and come out stronger. The village slept better that night, perhaps from fatigue, perhaps from knowing that even odors turn into stories when shared. And I fell asleep listening to the wind at the eaves, grateful to live in a place where even a boot can be a reason for gentle laughter. Early, when the clouds came with little dark bellies, it was Shepherd Matthias's turn for leather and honor. He had a habit of mixing up his feet, insisting the boot fit better on the side it didn't belong to. We tied it with a linen cord and a traveller's knot, so the shaft would obey the curves of his heel. His dog, faithful Loom, prowled curiously, sniffing the tallow like one sniffs a wooden saint. Matthias went down to the pasture, and the mud called him by name, wrapping his ankle like a distant cousin's embrace. We ran to help, and the village became a harvest crew, each one pulling a thread of the same story. Brigida brought a branch to use as a lever, and I held Matthias's hand, who laughed even as he was stuck up to the shin. When the boot finally came away with a soft pop, it lifted a perfume of living earth, cold and ancient. Matthias thanked us with fresh cheese, and Loom, pleased, wagged his tail and allowed us to note, rescued with honor. We learned then that mud is no enemy. It is merely an invitation to arrive together, step by step. The greatest misunderstanding came on a Saturday when the twins, Tu and Tiago, each swore the day bore his name. The rain had smudged a stroke on Brigida's board, and the charcoal, capricious, looked like two letters hugging. Neighbors gathered at the bakehouse door, and the heat of fresh bread swelled both words and tempers. Tu said he had heard his mother call him early. Tiago retorted that hearing one's mother did not count as a decree from heaven. I proposed an old raffle, a pebble inside the boot. Whoever guessed which toe it rested near would have the turn. The pebble chose Tiago, and Tu made the pout of a big boy, which soon faded when his brother offered him half the way. Off they went then, in a strange measure, one leather step, the other cloth, like two violinists tuning the same song. The whole street applauded softly, for in a village joy walks barefoot so as not to wake worries. On the return, the boot bore a new smell, a mix of yeast and rain, and we all found it almost festive. Brigida drew another star beside their names, a reminder that even well-seasoned quarrels become bread. On a grey evening it fell to Bento the blacksmith to take temporary custody of our leather treasure. He wished to be kind to the boot and set it by the forge, to take on human warmth, he said, scratching his chin. The leather, however, drank in too much heat and shrank like apple peel under an All Souls' Day sun. We rushed in with damp cloths, brief prayers, and the patience reserved for things we still wished to love. We packed the shaft with warm straw, slid in a wooden spoon as a mold, and massaged tallow into the blacksmith's regrets. The smell that rose was a mixture of smoke, hammered iron, and ancient grease, a decided aroma that spoke to the nostrils without asking leave. Bento turned red as an ember and swore he'd chew his own tongue before repeating the error. The boot, vain, yielded again, creaking a sigh that sounded like forgiveness. There remained, however, a little wrinkle in the shaft, a crooked smile that made it more human. If boots can be people, Brigida drew a small hammer beside his name, to remind us that even crafts overheat when they mean to help. When the south winds brought rains of indecision, Donna Quiteria came with a veil in her hair and well-combed arguments. She said a midday downpour is half a misfortune, and thus deserved half a turn on the board's order. We gathered beneath the great fig tree, and the rustle of leaves seemed to whisper grandmotherly advice. To measure the exact time, Brigida scored a line on a candle and proposed that the flame teach us justice. The flame, an ancient lady, burned down to the mark, and there it rested, as one who agrees in silence. Quiteria went off content, stepping in the mud with the elegance of someone learning to dance in a single shoe. When she returned the boot, she left a lavender kerchief in the shaft, and its gentle scent tamed the old smells for a whole day. We wrote down, Quiteria's half-turn, paid in fragrance, and no one dared argue with a justice that perfumed the air. At night, the street smelled of rain and tired flowers, and the heart felt lighter, like bread that has risen just right. I closed the window carefully, grateful to live in a place where even fairness can have a fragrance. On a market morning, it was young Nando's turn, quick of hands and scatterbrained in his thoughts. He tied the boot with a thin cord and set off down the road, whistling softly so as not to wake the rain. In the bustle of the carts, a brazen goose seized the cord halfway, perhaps taking it for a silver worm. Nando ran after it, begging Our Lady to understand that certain thefts are all beak and curiosity. The goose, queen unto herself, stuck her head into the shaft and marched on, and now we had a boot that honked. The whole market made way, laughing with their eyes, and I, moved to pity, stood guard with a willow branch. When at last we freed the beak from the leather, there lingered a smell of wet feather, crushed grain, and wounded dignity. Nando paid for the scare with 2 withered apples and promised to keep better watch over the cords of life. Brigida drew a tiny feather beside his name, a reminder that even luck has wings. The boot rested beneath the potter's stall, murmuring creaks that sounded like proverbs. The sourest case happened with Rosa and Crispim, a couple as stubborn as 2 millstones. Rosa said she had sewn cloth for 3 winters and deserved a dry path to the little church. Crispim thumped his chest, claiming he had dug ditches in the downpour, a task for feet that called for leather. The debate rose like dough in a warm bowl, and the neighbors sharpened opinions like bread knives. Brigida, with her bored and bell-clear voice, proposed a gentle sentence. Rosa would take the way there, Crispim would have the way back. She accepted with a sigh that smelled of linen thread. He agreed with the grumble of a tired hoe. The boot made half a pilgrimage and half a return, carrying promises on the way out and weariness on the way back. At day's end I saw the 2 share cabbage soup, each with 1 foot warmed by the other's kindness. On the board, Brigida sketched a crooked heart, because true loves rarely keep perfect time. And the street, which had heard raised voices, fell asleep content to the timid sound of 2 spoons tapping the same rim. On the eve of St. Michael, the clouds thickened the river like broth forgotten on the fire. It was the turn of Simo the boatman, who knew the current the way one knows an old friend's humor. Climbing the slick bank, the boot's sole kissed the slime and slipped with a yelp that made us laugh first and startle after. We watched the leather drift downstream, spinning like a chestnut leaf, valiant and lost. The boys ran along the bank, arms in the air, offering promises the river does not understand. Amancio the fisherman cast his net as one casts a story over forgetfulness. The mesh embraced the shaft, and we all pulled, 1 step back, 2 of hope forward. When it came up, dripping, the boot smelled of cold stone, crushed rushes, and secrets from the riverbed. Simone paid the ransom with a small trout and the laughter of a man reborn from a stumble. Brigida marked a fish on the board, reminding us that sometimes life returns what we carry off by accident. That same late afternoon, a pilgrim reached the village, cape worn thin and a scallop on his hat. He said his name was Teobaldo and offered us a trick gathered from the roads, cork insoles cut from old bark. Cork keeps warmth and keeps no grudges, he smiled, and the phrase settled into the boot like a blessing. We boiled walnut leaves with a thread of poor vinegar, and the leather drank the infusion like winter tea. The creaking calmed, and the smell turned to something of a wood after rain, more tree than stable. The sacristan came near, sniffed respectfully, and declared that angels too are fond of good wood. We gave the pilgrim a small round of bread and a dry corner in the barn, and he paid us with stories that warm. Brigida drew a tiny shell beside his name, in gratitude and as a souvenir of travel. That night the boot slept wrapped in a linen towel, like a tired child that finally finds a lap. And as I put out the fire, I thought that some kinds of knowledge arrive on unfamiliar footsteps, just to teach us to walk better. On the day the measure of rye came up short, Anselmo the baker looked at the boot the way one looks at a poor bushel. He filled it with grain until the shaft seemed to smile, tapped the leather lightly to settle the bounty, and swore the bread would come out with the weight of justice. The oven breathed hot, and the air mixed the cereal's sweetness with the honest hint of tallow, making a perfume of fields on harvest day. We laughed without malice when the first loaf brought a touch of leather, discreet as a memory kept behind the ear. No one refused a slice. Hunger doesn't wrinkle its nose for long. Blushing, Anselmo promised 2 loaves for the next rainy vigil, out of penance and affection. We washed the shaft with warm water and ash, and the boot returned a humble shine, almost grateful. What remained smelled of toasted wheat, clean straw, and a kitchen that has heard a lot of talk. Brigida drew an ear of grain beside his name, reminding us that sometimes the right measure fits where you least expect it. And the day went on gently, crumbs on the apron and laughter throwing a quiet feast. In a thin, winded dawn, they knocked at the window of Lucia the midwife, calling her to a berth on the far side of the marsh. It was her turn for leather and courage, and she slipped on the boot unhurriedly, like one putting on an old piece of advice. She crossed the mud, stepping on stones, one foot steadied by the firm shaft, the other guided by faith and balance. In the young woman's house, rue and fennel simmered, and the walls held a silence that felt like prayer. When the small cry opened in the air, the world grew wider, and even the rain turned to listening. Lucia came back at dawn with tired eyes and the smile of one who has held a beginning in her hands. The boot now bore a new perfume, warm milk, bruised herbs, and the good smoke of a patient stove. Before such a fragrance, no one dared call it a smell. We preferred to say an announcement of life. Brigida marked an 8-pointed star on the board, a sign that leather too knows how to cross miracles, and I thought, with the window still beaded with dew, that some scents are born to teach the heart how to breathe more slowly. When a truce of clouds opened the day, Esteban the beekeeper proposed a patch of sweet wisdom. He brought a little wax from his hives, yellow as a new candle, swearing the leather would drink in protection. I warmed the wax in a clay saucer, and the sheen ran along the seams as if we were writing a letter against water. But Esteban, generous, left a thread of honey too, and the golden temptation stayed at the rim of the shaft. In the afternoon, the bees came like visiting relatives, circling the boot with respect and appetite. We hurried over with a bundle of fennel and a smoking brand, asking leave of the winged ladies. They accepted the bargain, drawing back to the scent of home, and the boot remained anointed and important, like a newly cleaned saint. The perfume that lingered mixed warm honey, light smoke, and satisfied leather, something that made the street gentler. Esteban received a plate of migas and a compliment worth 2 harvests. Brigida drew a small honeycomb on the board, reminding us that sweetness too knows how to guard our feet sometimes. From then on, we instituted Airing Sunday, a new custom with an old-time face. Early on, we hung the boot in the fig tree, belly open to the wind like fish to salt without hurry. Below, we scattered bay leaves and rosemary, so the air would learn good manners as it passed through the leather. The children kept a guard of silence, and even the roosters seemed to crow more softly, out of respect for the shoe's rest. While the wind worked, we told stories of roads and arrivals, each offering up a memory to scent the next. When the bell marked the 9th hour, we took the boot down and wrapped it in a cloth that smelled of sun. The shaft seemed to smile, and the creak had the contented timbre of a well-warmed old chair. On that day, no one claimed a turn. Even need withdrew, like a creature that understands an open hand. Brigida drew a little sun beside the list, swearing leather too needs a holiday. And as I gathered the herbs, I felt the whole village breathe lighter, as if learning to walk first with the chest and only then with the feet. It was then that Albano the tailor, master of fine threads and wide ideas, decided to give our solitary leather some cloth for company. He sewed a gaiter from old wool, dyed with walnut and bark tea, and christened it Overfoot, as if he'd made a godchild. The piece embraced the bare foot with an ill-fitted elegance, trying to imitate nobility where there was only goodwill. At the first drizzle, though, the wool drank sky without measure and weighed like overdue judgment. Albano blushed, promising to tighten the stitch and teach the cloth the art of saying, Enough. Dip. We wrung the gaiter on the threshold, and from it came a warm trickle, sighing like a contented frog. The boot beside it seemed to laugh in a low creak, complicit and patient. The smell that lingered mixed walnut, wet wool, and a prickle of wounded pride, the sort that scars in silence. Even so, the invention won a place on Brigida's board, beneath the drawing of a little pair of scissors. It was noted, Albano gave cloth warmth, drank the rain for everyone. Then came the patron's feast, and the village wore its best patches as if donning brightness itself. We needed the processional platform to cross the mire without stumbling, and 3 bearers shyly vied for the honor. We decided the boot would guide the way by sections, blessing each step with its half-nobility. First came old Afonso, who walked short and sure, reminding his knees of youth long lost. Then the young woman Iria, carrying flowers and a timid smile, while the leather said Amen on every stone. Lastly, Clemente the sacristan lifted the platform and his voice, and the rain moved, tuned itself to a respectful drizzle. The air smelled of candle wax, crushed petals, and a remnant of tallow, the perfume of a poor and happy procession. When we set the saint down in the chapel, the bell rang like a spoon on an earthen cup, gently, without breaking anything. Brigida drew a small bell on the board and smiled, saying the boot also knew how to pray with its feet, and I felt that for a whole day we all walked in the same cadence as when the heart chooses another's beat. When autumn chose to lengthen the shadows and the rain turned into a habit of the roof tiles, we realized the boot had begun to speak another language. At the end of one return, the instep stitch opened in a tired yawn, the kind that asks no one's leave. We sat in the hearth's warm light and ran waxed linen thread through it with a bone needle that had inherited the patience of mothers and grandmothers. Albano brought blonde pitch, and Bento the blacksmith, now prudent, breathed the bellows lightly to soften the tallow without raising a spectre. The seam went in, one stitch of hope, another of remembrance, and the boot, stubborn, nipped my finger like a mischievous kid goat. We laughed softly, out of respect, and went on, taking care that the leather not recall the old fire. The air took on the smell of pitch and sweet smoke, mixed with the milky sap of the fig tree dripping outside. When I tied off the last knot, the shaft let out a small creak. Half thanks, half secret. With her charcoal, Brigida drew a finer stroke on the board, like one writing the breath that fails but still sustains. I thought that certain things, before they take their leave, teach us how to stitch the silence. The next morning, beneath the same fig tree that gave us windy Sundays, we held a village council. Each person brought a destiny for the veteran leather. A coarse salt pouch, a sheath for a gentle knife, a belt for old Afonso, a little herb pillow for the midwife Lucia. The proposals smelled of usefulness and care, but amid the voices, the rain tapped lightly, like a hand asking to speak. Brigida raised the board and said calmly that before becoming a keepsake, the boot deserved one last pilgrimage. It would pass one final time where it had always served. Mill, chapel, well, pasture and oven, sharing its step as one shares a blessing. We agreed in a lovely silence, the kind that brings elbows together on the same bench. We polished the leather with a thread of poor oil and a sprig of rosemary until it shone without vanity. The scent that rose was of a good farewell, bruised herbs, gentle tallow, and hope kept in clean cloth. Brigida drew a waning moon beside the names, a sign that what departs can also console, and I, with the boot in my arms, felt the light weight of things that come to an end without offending anyone. When the clouds broke, we began the final pilgrimage with the steps of those holding a thread of light. We went first to the mill, where Firmino tipped his cap and the wheel clapped water, laughing at our procession. I brushed the boot against the stone corner, and it gathered bran dust, as if putting on the memory of bread. Then we went on to the chapel. Clemente the sacristan touched the shaft with the candle's tip, leaving a varnish of devout wax. The priest murmured words of field and sky, and the leather answered with a humble creak that only we understood. At the well we lowered a bucket and let the boot see its face in the water, kindling glints of a split cloud. Each child tossed a small pebble, making circles that looked like rings of promise. The water returned a convent's silence, and even the wind leaned in, curious about our humble rite. Brigida, ever on watch, drew a little fish of light on the board on account of the reflections, and I felt that all of it was a farewell that walked, without fanfare, with feet held close together. In the pasture, Matthias waited with faithful Lumi, and the sheep opened a path, white as a clean thought. We rested the shaft against an alder trunk so the sap would lend breath to the tired seams. Then we went to Anselmo's oven, where the heat embraced us, and he stamped the sole on a loaf, a seal of friendship. There was a scent of wheat, sweet smoke, and that old tallow that now seemed like low music. At dusk, we returned to the fig tree. We hung the boot on its usual branch, belly open to rest. Donna Quiteria brought a lavender kerchief, and Albano tied it to the shaft, like someone covering an elderly shoulder. The wind blew softly, settling the cloth, and the street took on the look of a tidied room. Brigida drew a small bough on the board, a sign that the path closes with tenderness. The roosters gathered up their voices early, and the night arrived soft, without heavy steps. And I understood, with peace in my chest, that the boot already knew how to make its own way back into our story. The next morning, when the fig tree unrolled short shadows, we made the final gesture. Brigida took Albano's scissors and, with Clemente's blessing, cut the shaft into gentle strips. Each family received a scrap the size of a thumb, kept in a linen cloth. We said it would line seed pockets, quiet the creaks of a chest, and remember the road. The foot of the fig tree kept the soul, buried among pebbles and leaves, as if we were planting memory. Bento the blacksmith struck the trunk 3 times, promising care. Estevão blew a wisp of sweet smoke. Lucia tucked her scrap into her herb pillow and smiled, because certain beginnings ask for ancient watches. The air smelled of tired lavender, clean leather, and damp earth learning to rest. Brigida sketched the last figure on the board. A small boot, whole in memory, divided in use. And the village, grateful, drew in like bread that finishes rising far from the noise. Now, when the fire snaps and the night gathers the body of the village, I return to this story with slow affection. I see the humble shine of the leather, hear the soft creak, breathe the perfume of tallow, herbs, and flour. We learned then that justice can be a single shoe, and that joy fits into alternating steps. That sense, even the difficult ones, become bridges when crossed hand in hand. That gentle laughter heals misunderstandings, and that patience stitches tears we didn't know how to name. If anything remained unexplained, we accepted it like mist that sharpens the outline of the distant bell. For there are mysteries that ask for no answer, only company, like rain that prefers a roof tile to a sermon. I close my eyes and give thanks for the boot, which taught us path, measure, and comfort without raising its voice. The breeze slips through the crack and carries with it a trace of leather and lavender, sharing sleep throughout the house. And I fall asleep certain that tomorrow our steps will once again know how to choose the dry part of the mud.